Hello everybody, this is Vera Nazarian and I'm going to do a reading for you today. This is a part of the TagCon 2021 Quantum Blue. It's one of the panel presentations, and this reading is going to be unrelated to the Atlantis Grail because I always like to do something that's a little different every year. So this is going to be a reading of a short story called Streets Running Like a River. This short story is a part of the greater world of another series that I have planned that I'm going to be writing, and it is called, it's a series called Pantheon. It's not a final, the name could be subject to change, but the Pantheon series is based on the idea of an iron honeycomb as opposed to like an iron curtain where the countries are divided, separated by a great wall or a great, political division. And this actually, the iron honeycomb is a concept of the whole world being isolated like that. Every country is a walled off fortress. And this idea came to me a long time ago. I mean, we're talking about decades, and this was long before all the world events and everything. So it has nothing to do with anything that's happening now, but it's a little bit oddly pertinent, especially with the shutdown and the pandemic of last year of 2020. So, but anyway, this thing, this has to do with the main character of this series or this world. She is kind of an aging warrior woman, and this is a near future, and in this near future, she is Italian. So this is actually, I don't know why I keep on doing this. Gwen Lark is Italian, or she has an Italian background, and so is this character. I'm not Italian. Why am I doing this? But just, take it for what it is. This takes place in an alternate or near future world, and it's in Venice. And this woman is, like I said, she's no longer young, but she's not old, but she's not in her prime, and she's a warrior woman. She's a swordswoman, a master swordswoman, and she's returning home, and she's returning home to Italy, to Venice. And let's go ahead and begin. And it's best that you just hear it than me explaining it, because it explains itself. Streets running like a river. I got off the plane at Venezia with 2 swords. They were poor quality asps with long, thin epi blades that I'd gotten at the airport gift shop in Roma Maiora before boarding the plane for the connecting flight, having checked in my own unnecessarily, forgetting for a moment that it was Venezia I was coming home to, the birthland of naked steel. One of the swords had a tiny, uncomfortable 3-ring grip, so that I wondered how I'd get my fingers through that contraption, and whoever comes up with these useless designs. Until it occurred to me that the 3 rings formed a clover pattern, and it was one of the popular house affiliations. Pick one, and you automatically become an honorary member for the duration of your stay. And I had now unwittingly affiliated myself with Poventa, the house of the poor. I was a thoughtless idiot. The houses were advertising again. I had thought that nonsense over and done with the coming in power of the autocrate Rorin. But obviously, there were still undercurrents of insurrection. What a time to be in Venezia. Paola! Someone cried, and I turned my head to search the crowd near the international baggage claims. A burly man with red gold hair and beard stood up on his toes like a ballet dancer, as though he needed any help, towering over the crowd, and gesticulated to me enthusiastically with his own short dagger, holding it up with insolence by the blade between forefinger and thumb, so that I could see the affiliation. The pommel wore the unmistakable shape of the Moretti rose flower, and with it came a pang of familiar pride, followed by a strange, almost unfamiliar sensation of warmth rising. I felt my throat constrict for a second as I thought of my childhood, all coming forth like a bouquet bursting from the fingers of a conjurer, in the colors of earth and antiquity and sweet Italia. And that man? Could it really be Barto? After all these years, I knew him in a single blink. Family Italia was around me now, and I was in its bosom again, after nearly a decade abroad, after working on the other end of the iron honeycomb. First entrenched in the restricted formality of Gran Bretagna for 5 interminably long years, and then spending close to 5 more in the gaudy excess of unified America with its life on a grand scale mentality. In both cases, the houses that employed me were of the highest elite, and yet I felt the inevitable wear on my spirit of having to resign myself to serving not my betters, but those who could best pay me. As far as what I was getting best paid for, suffice it to say that it involved my expert ability to wield deadly steel, and earned me my previously non-existent middle name. I was now Paola Morte Moretti, whether I liked it or disdained it. My reputation preceded me in these places, and now that I've returned home, it must needlessly follow me, like a plodding mare, or rather a shadow carcass of one. Now I was to take on brand new employment, unusual in the sense that it was merely a resumption of my original employment while here on my native soil. For I was still indentured to serve the Chiarenza, and although my obligation to that noblest of houses was almost at an end, I still had 1 year of service remaining that I owed to them. Once the year was over, I would be free at last, free to be my own mistress, and free to serve no one but my own house, the ancient and impoverished Moretti. Paola, over here, damn you! Again I heard the voice of the bearded, red gold-haired giant, indeed, none other than Bartolo Chiarenza, who was both an old friend and a very distant cousin of Moretti, here to take me directly to the old city villa of Chiarenza. By now, warmth was overwhelming. It rose up inside me like the lagoon of Venezia at high tide, filling me to overflowing at the sight of cousin Barto. I raised my hand and waved back at him with the pommel of the Poventa asp, held with equal disdain between forefinger and thumb, while moving through the thick crowd toward him. What's this crap? Barto exclaimed as soon as I was within reach. What kind of pitiful steel defames your proud hand, cousin? Poventa? Your idea of a sick joke? Damn you too, Barto. It's all they had at the gift shop, I replied, my tired voice cracking, my face transformed with both a shy and somehow giddy smile, meanwhile putting the cheap ass back in its sheath at my waist. Then I came into his great bone-crunching embrace while hearing the thump of his dagger slapping my back. Ah, what kind of excuse is that? My old Paola would have had touched a Poventa stick with gloves on. What happened to her? Well, blame it on jet lag and exhaustion. Your old Paola is now 10 years older and hardly much wiser. Besides, I packed my own steel very carefully away, just as Francisco taught us all these years ago. How long has it been now? 15 years since the old man sleeps on a marble slab in the Moretti crypt. Bartolo sighed, and I felt his large frame shudder as he released me and stood back examining me, while I took my own time looking him up and down. You look good, Paola cara. Ah, and you look much better than me, Barto. I see no gray hairs anywhere, not in your beard, and not on top of that dense orange head. Bartolo made a sound that was the snort of a draft horse, coupled with the luff of a drunken jackal. Time is my wench and knows better than to spoil the color of this sexy mane. Now then, how was your flight, Bambina? And even more importantly, what news of the outside world? What can you tell me? I shook my head and headed to the baggage claim carousel with Bartolo trailing me. Now, you know I can't tell you anything, donkey. Yes, my flight was tolerable and infernally long. Thank you for asking. But that's all you get. In my reluctance to speak, I was not merely being coy. Since I had just come through the rare terror that was international customs for the second time, after the initial check in Roma Maiora, and my luggage was originally coming from a foreign plane. Even now that I was past that initial hurdle, I was still tainted by the ugly reality of being an outsider, and legally required to comply with the foreign non-disclosure agreement I had signed when I had originally been permitted to leave. Whatever I learned on the other side of the iron honeycomb, the wall of information silence between here and there had to remain in place, was inviolate, and I had to abide by it or risk severe repercussions, not only for myself but for those with whom I communicated. I was thus a pariah, permanently forced to keep my mouth shut about my experiences, all the wonders or ills or idiocies I'd encountered on the outside. And I was going to be considered this kind of special case for quite a long time to come. A dangerous case. From now on, in so many ways, I was going to be painfully alone. Indeed, this particular baggage carousel before me, a sadly deserted oasis, sparsely regurgitating items for an elite or unlucky few, was a reminder of my solitary condition. It was serving only my lonely international flight. Almost no one else was coming from abroad like me. Most everyone else here in the airport was domestic. Thinking back, I could have counted the passengers on my flight on one hand, all of us returning from beyond the iron honeycomb, all of us tense, sullen, not meeting each other's gazes, ready to be searched, questioned, and detained at any moment. And now our few bags were here, sailing in lonely splendor after being processed and thoroughly examined by customs, or better to say, sanitized. Bartolo simply couldn't appreciate the uniqueness of my situation. His inability to be careful in my permanently suspect company was stunningly stupid, in addition to being endearing. It struck me again how much I missed this big fool, this gigantic awkward lug of a cousin who had been such a big part of my early childhood. And yet he went on. Ah, come on, carissima Paola, don't make me beg. Not even a tiny little nugget of news, of enlightenment. Not even that, I said with a thin smile. Seriously, Barto, aren't you afraid of the nearest sacerdote hearing you ask me this? After all these years that I've been away, nothing's changed. I have no doubt they still lurk in every shadow, and there are probably at least 3 in the crowd alone, and a 4th riding the damn baggage carousel with the bags. I'll take my chances, he said, leaning in behind my ear while I focused my sharp observation skills on the cavalcade of luggage as it circled the conveyor belt. Barto, I mumbled after a few moments of feeling his hot breath washing my neck. Give me some space now, okay? Just one nugget, he whispered persistently. Give me one, please tell me anything. I glanced back at him, then returned my attention to the carousel and said very softly, Fine, here's one. The outside world is crazy. Absolutely flaming insane. Everyone has gone mad and everyone wants to get out and no one can. The iron honeycomb keeps us all inside our borders until we go stark raving mad with wanderlust. Barto exhaled, his breath stirring the hair on the nape of his neck that had fallen out from his loose ponytail. What's Gran Britannia like, cousin? Do they drink tea with every meal? Is it true they still have that old senile king? Barto, I'm going to have to plug your mouth with my scarf if you don't stop, I mumbled, finally seeing my own 2 bags emerging from the maw and sailing along the conveyor toward me. a small basic rolling suitcase, and a long high-end sword case of reinforced military-grade materials. Inside it were my treasures. 3 magnificent swords and 4 daggers of varying length and designations, all bearing the rose crest of Moretti on their antique pommels. Here we go, come to madre, I intoned with satisfaction, leaning forward and plucked the sword case followed by the suitcase from the conveyor. So now you have yours? You can toss the Poventa trash, right? Bartolo nodded to the 2 cheap asp swords attached to my belt with their embarrassing clover pommels. All in good time. It was best not to attract undue attention to my own rare quality steel, and hence to me. So I chose wisely to keep the asps precisely where they were on my person and ignored Bartolo's taunt. Allow me. And Bartolo took the suitcase from my left hand, knowing better than I should try to claim my swords. Careful, just don't drop it, donkey. I have some delicate items inside, I said, as we proceeded to walk from the airport claims area. Where are you parked? Bartolo snorted again, carrying my suitcase in his large, beefy grasp with the ease of a feather pillow, and ignoring the rolling wheels. Parked? Is that what they do in airports in Britannia and America? You forgot how it's done. Oh, yes, of course. I shook my head again with another tired by fond smile. There's another cousin even now, endlessly circling the airport, right? Naturally. Bartolo nodded toward the glass outside doors leading to the arrivals and departures drop-off area. So, who is it? Anyone I know? I said as we walked past the security guards and into the bright sunlight of Venezia. No answer came from my brute of a cousin. I blinked, carefully maneuvering my sword case around passerby, and allowed Bartolo to take the lead. The madhouse that was Venezia became apparent already, with a sea of vehicles of all makes and models circling the few lanes near the curb in the usual merry-go-round, horns blaring, policia in uniforms with standard-issue multi-sword belts, gesticulating with disgust at those who stepped too long at the curb. The noise, the damp air, the ever-present smell of slightly decadent seawater from the lagoons, the wonder that was Venezia, all clamored together, and this was still only the airport area on the mainland, a few more miles from where the lapping waters began. Ah, I was home. As I breathed the air with pleasure and nostalgia, a luxury sports convertible pulled up to the curb directly before us. Bartolo waved, and the driver, a truly beautiful young man with long honey blonde hair that shone with gold and copper highlights in the sun, dressed carelessly and fashionably, did not bother to wave back, and merely stared without any enthusiasm. Squinting against the sun glare, I saw a very bored face of sculptured lean angles and nothing but disdain in the narrowed blue eyes, as soon as he very deliberately removed his expensive, polished black sunglasses. "That's all right?" I asked with one raised brow. "That's your charge," Bartolo replied with a crafty grin. "Surprise, cara! Come meet your newest pupil!" And then he yelled in a bass voice like a trumpet. "Adonetto Ciarenza! Here you are, and here she is! Come and meet your new fencing master, Signorina Paola!" So, I thought, this was the horrible boy I was to teach for a whole year of my indentured servitude. Adonetto Ciarenza, the spoiled brat eldest son of the Ciarenza, who was going to make my life a living hell for the next many months. Oh yes, I've heard all about Adonetto, had investigated him thoroughly, in fact, while still on my way home, and the conclusion I've come to was a grim one. This young man was a lazy, useless player who spent his days and nights drinking, brawling, and screwing, going from dance club to duel to orgy and sleeping till 4 every day, only to repeat the dreary cycle, while his father despaired of him ever becoming suitable to lead his house. I had my work cut out for me. The convertible idled at the curb, superbly tuned engine running, and Adonetto did not bother to get out of the car. He merely nodded with insolence, taking in my plain and rather homely travel attire. Dark pants pulled over scruffed working boots and worn jacket over a dowdy gray shirt, buttoned all the way up to my throat, where an old scarf looped twice, and waved one hand at me, elegant fingers dangerously close to forming the insulting thumb gesture. Benvenuto in Italia, signorina. How lovely to have you here. Come all this way just for me. His voice was melodious despite its devastating tone of sarcasm. Please forgive me if I don't get up, but you know how it is. Airport policia are unforgiving creatures. I was certain he also threw a very brief, disgusted look at my polenta asps. But at least, unlike Barto, said nothing. No problem, and nice to meet you, Adonetto, I said with a blank face after the tiniest pause, giving my new pupil a brief nod. Then I followed Bartolo, who went around the back and opened a small trunk. He stuffed my suitcase inside, and then both of us realized there was not enough room for the long sword case. I'll take the swords with me in the back seat, I told cousin Barto, whose sheepish expression in that moment made him look almost 10 years old and was ridiculously endearing. Lord, how I missed having Bartolo around. So sorry about that, Cara. I know those precious blades of yours must be kept safe, he muttered. Bah, I didn't think. Else we would have taken the big SUV with a bigger luggage area. Relax, Barto. I'll manage. I came around and got in the back with its rather narrow, sporty bench seat, trying not to poke or scratch the fine leather upholstery with the scabbards of the 2 cheap asps still attached ignobly to my person. Then I carefully positioned the sword case containing my real steel on the floor before the empty seat next to me, so that it rested against the back and stuck out slightly like a strange headless passenger. Bartolo scratched his ruddy beard worriedly. Are you sure you don't want to sit in the front with Adonetto, so you two can get to know each other? I shook my head with a tiny smile and motioned for Bartolo to take the front. There will be plenty of time to get acquainted later. Besides, you need more legroom. Sit, and let's get out of here before the policia notices us lingering on the curb. In reply, Bartolo got in. At once, Adonetto Chiarenza revved up the engine with an angry roar. Without a word, his sunglasses were back on, sleek and menacing. In the next breath, he jerked into motion and started moving through the crazy traffic toward Venezia. A few miles of crawling along a curving verdant thoroughfare on the mainland brought us to the early edges of the city, where land seemed to have lost its mind and gave in to blue sky and water. Here the lagoon and the canals took over, and the land buses could go no further. Traffic fell off immediately. Meanwhile, the remaining convertibles started to switch to the water navigation systems and transform before our eyes into the vaporetti, or water buses, that were the main mode of transport along the canals. As we entered the water, Adonetto engaged our own vehicle's aqua nav, retracting the wheels until the lower shape of the car was now a sleek boat, with the rubber tires recessed on the underside to provide added buoyancy and improve flotation, while a prow sharpened at the nose with a rudder descended in the back near the trunk. I stared with glowing pleasure of familiarity as we slid along the lagoon water surface, almost flying as we cut our path along white, frothing churn on both sides of the vehicle. In moments, we were halfway across the lagoon, aiming for the heart of old Venezia. All the while, Adonetto remained mostly silent, while Bartolo chattered with enthusiasm and constantly pointed out things and places I knew very well, but he was certain I'd forgotten. The green-brown shadow water surrounded us, in places mysteriously displaying splotches of teal and verdigris, followed by sudden mirror shards of brightness that was reflected sunlight. I listened to Cousin Barto absent-mindedly and watched it lap in wavelets against the peculiar walls of the approaching shoreline, formed of narrow walkways around outlying buildings. The endless rows of houses, lining up like honor guard, interspersed with occasional breaks leading into lesser canal alleys. Eventually, we approached the wide mouth opening along the exterior shoreline. That was the Grand Canal, an S-shaped snake, major waterway curling through the city. We entered it swiftly, with Adonetto maneuvering us past a few other vaporetti and gondolas at heedless breakneck speed. Frequent bridges swept above us, including the Rialto, which I recognized with a bittersweet pang. I had once kissed a man very dear to me while standing on that very bridge and looking out over the muddy flow of the canal. We thrust our way onward, cutting the waters of the Grand Canal into a churning foam open wound, formed by the merciless sword blade that was our vehicle, circling the ancient structures and piazzas toward the Palace of the Doge, and beyond it where the Chiarenza Villa reposed in decaying splendor. Then we took a turn into a lesser waterway and meandered through alleys and past houses opening into secret piazzas and cul-de-sacs. At one point, as the vehicle floated near the sunken steps of a small stone square with a fountain, we were greeted by hoots, whistles, and cries from a minor gang of youths who congregated around the fountain and seemed to know Adonetto from afar, and likely recognized his distinctive convertible. "Chiarenza! Qua ti voglio!" one of them cried angrily. "Hey, over here! Where have you been? I want my money, stronzo!" The same dark-haired young man stood up from his lazy repose on the rim of the fountain and waved with the pommel of his sword, while others stirred around him, and the hoots and whistles increased. "Ti amo, Ancio, De Luca!" Adonetto brought one hand to his lips in an air kiss and yelled back in a ringing, insolent voice, "You know exactly what to do to get it back. It's simple. Do what I told you, and I'll pay you immediately. If you don't, then I'll pay you when I see you next. In hell." In reply, the dark-haired De Luca spat and hurled back an intricate volley of obscenities. He then ran up to the very edge of the steps before the water began and stood with his sword raised, blade up, pointing with it directly at our vehicle, which was floating in a slow coasting drift, a mere 10 feet away. "Very well. Turn your back and run. Coward Chiarenza! Run from me, whore son, and may you sink deep in the canal and swim with the crap that floats in it. Figlio di puttana!" "Okay, what is going on?" I said in a cautious voice, seeing how Adonetto responded immediately by tightening his lips and revving the motor, and then started to maneuver and park the vehicle at the steps. "Whoa, whoa!" Bartolo explained meanwhile, starting back and forth between Adonetto and the shore, where a small crowd had now gathered as the rest of the youths approached the edge of the sunken steps. "What are you doing, boy? Why are we stopping? Who are these idiots? Your father hears about this and we're both going to get our asses handed to us." "Shut up." Adonetto cut him off in a hard voice and with only a side glance at Bartolo, not even deigning to look in my direction. "I'll take care of this." "Adonetto, no," I said. "This is not a good idea." In response, the convertible motor went silent. Adonetto easily climbed out of the driver's seat, which was now adjacent to the steps, and jumped onto the shore with an elegant, smooth motion born of practice. I observed how he held his primary sword in a loose grip in his right hand, while the second remained in the scabbard. Not a bad form, but nothing to brag about. "Adonetto, don't!" My voice sounded far too mild and trailed off because at this point my clinical curiosity was engaged. Bartolo and I watched him take a few steps forward with fearless aggression. The gang members immediately cleared a semicircle around him, and only De Luca remained facing him directly. "I'm here now. What did you call me again?" Adonetto spoke through his teeth as he and De Luca began circling each other slowly, both proudly upright, still only posturing. "Ah, Madre de Dio," Bartolo muttered, sitting up in his seat and starting to get out of the car. But I put my hand on his shoulder to stop him. "Wait." Bartolo frowned at me. "We can't just let this happen, cara. Old Chiarenza will kill me and eat my liver for letting this get out of hand." I nodded. "I know. And we won't. But just let it play out. Just wait." Meanwhile, the young men, mostly older teens and possibly young men in their early 20s, made noises of encouragement. "Fight! Fight!" they chanted, and in seconds various daggers and stilettos appeared, and swords came forth from scabbards, the usual peacock show. 9 times out of 10, such dick-waving came to nothing. I knew with certainty, born of extensive experience. Here in Italia especially, the old anti-sword violence laws were still being properly enforced. "I called you a coward, Adonetto Ciarenza," De Luca said with an inflamed, intense expression, and raised his sword in a horizontal position. Bringing the pommel up close to his chin in a parody of aiming to shoot. Then extended his reach again, taunting the other. "But you're also a thief. You have what's mine, and I want it now." Adonetto snorted. "Matteo De Luca, you are a delusional pezzo de merda. I already told you the first time. I'll pay you gladly. All you have to do is get on your knees and kiss my ring in front of Carmelina Sciarretta. If you prefer, it can be underneath the bedroom balcony of Carmelina, and she doesn't even have to be present, as long as we have a picture of you doing it." Matteo De Luca spat on the ground again. "Vaffanculo." Adonetto's lips curled derisively. "Very well. You don't do it, you won't do it, and I won't pay. Have a nice afternoon, piccione." And then Adonetto insolently turned his back on the dark-haired young man and his comrades and started to walk back to the car. He was followed by hostile boos and whistles of the gang, but ignored them admirably. Just for a moment I began to think better of him. There was some hope in this boy after all. In front of me, Bartolo exhaled in relief and twisted his bulky shape that barely fit in the passenger seat to lean closer and look at me with admiration. "You were right, Cousin Paula," he said with a wink, and patted my arm with his large, beefy hand. "The boy can handle himself, and no harm done." His words were cut off when a short, needle-sharp stiletto lodged itself in the side of his throat. I gasped. Bartolo froze, gurgled, while blood started pumping rhythmically from his deep wound. With a look of utmost surprise, he raised his hand to the wound, reaching for the dagger. "Barto, no!" I cried, while my own pulse exploded with terrible adrenaline-fueled motion. At the same time, a deep, long-repressed part of me, the part that contained my entire childhood folded up and compressed into a vulnerable ball of sensation, was going into ice-cold shock. "No, do not touch it! Stop!" I lurched forward in swift reflex, holding up my cousin's gradually slumping body as he slid back against the seat, choking on blood, his large, clumsy hand still trying to hold his own throat. It was my own voice speaking, hard and commanding and professional, but somehow I was floating outside my own body, looking down at us in utter disbelief. "Do not try to pull it out. Keep still. Please, Barto." In the blink of an eye, my gaze scanned the scene, and I saw the smirking youth who threw the dagger, recognizing him from the swift motion his body made, that I'd seen with my peripheral vision even before it happened. Even now, my professional instinct took over. At the same time, Adonetto, who'd had his back turned to them, now growled with fury. His face contorted and whirled around, this time raising his sword. He flung himself directly at the one who'd thrown the dagger. A maddened plunge of his sword inside the chest, and the other young man cried out and then collapsed on the steps, while Adonetto pulled his blade out with a fierce cry of satisfaction and kicked the still twitching body. What happened next was a messy, brawling horror. With yells of rage, the youths attacked all at once, and De Luca was the first to reach Adonetto. I glanced once at my poor beloved old friend Barto, bleeding out in precious seconds before my eyes. He desperately needed a hospital now. But if I recall correctly, in Venezia, no ambulance was ever going to be dispatched in a timely manner for one dying man. Besides, there was no time to even make a call. Right now, this instant, Adonetto, my charge, my pupil, my infernal responsibility, needed help. Or he was going to be a corpse too. And so I sprang out of the convertible, landing on the first step above the water, having drawn both the cheap-ass blades from their sheaths before my boots hit the ground. First, I took out the two young men closest to Adonetto, waving their blades uselessly at me. "Putana, putana, whore!" They called me in initial surprise, even as I pierced both between the ribs on the left side of their chests with a clean economy of motion, so that they were gone before they fell. While Adonetto's steel clashed rhythmically with Deluca's, I went after the large, burly oldest of the youths, who saw me coming and gave me an ugly scowl as he bared two long, wide daggers. I disarmed his right hand with a kick, then precisely nicked his left with the blade edge against the inside of his wrist. He dropped the dagger with a harsh cry in order to contain the sudden gush of bleeding, and I ignored him momentarily to go after two more youths in back of him. Behind me, I could still hear Adonetto, so I could safely ignore him for another few seconds. Next up, the trio with long dueling rapiers. Their wider, heavier blades would obliterate my flimsy asps if I let them come in direct contact, so no slashes or parries from me. I simply evaded, weapon on weapon, moving my body out of the way instead like lightning, and then used the fine points of my subpar weapons to pierce chests through to the hearts. Then things got a little hazy. I was in the zone, moving too fast for my mind to record the sequences, so that there were only targets, lunges, stabs, and opponents falling in their own blood. About 30 seconds later, there were about 24 bodies on the ground. Some of them were even still alive. I needed survivors to make the emergency call and make it worth their while for the ambulance to get here. But in my mind, I killed them all. It was the only way I could stop myself from perpetrating the carnage in reality, imagining them cut up and screaming for what they did to Barto. That and the fact that I needed them alive for Barto's sake. Ambulance fodder. I turned to look back at the car, and Barto was slumped on the seat, blood pouring out of him and straining the damned leather upholstery. Did the stiletto hit or even nick the carotid artery? A lot of blood, but hard to tell. A surge of despair washed over me. He wasn't going to make it. With fury, I turned my attention at last to Adonetto and Deluca, both panting and circling each other, thankfully still unhurt. Adonetto must have been aware with some part of his focused attention of the carnage happening around him, because he threw me a strange, intense look in which I read fear and sudden acknowledgement, and then he returned to his adversary. Once again, their swords clashed and parried. "Enough!" I roared at them. "Basta! Or do you want to die too?" They paused, and Deluca glared and hurled obscenities at me, but he definitely appeared wary and started to back away. "No, I'm not done with this piece of crap!" Adonetto exclaimed, brandishing his sword. "Oh, yes, you are," I said grimly, reaching out suddenly and grabbing the young man by the ear and pulling him to me like one would a 5-year-old, realizing with painful emotion that I was doing precisely what old Francesco Moretti would do to me and Barto all these years ago, separating us during fights by the ear and causing a small wrenching pain in order to drive a bucket of sense into us. Adonetto yelped in surprise, completely shocked by what I was doing. He then tried to twist out of my grasp, but I shoved him backward toward the car floating near the steps. "Get in, idiot, and hold Barto's neck carefully. Use a handkerchief, anything, just do not attempt to pull out the dagger." And then I turned to Deluca, still in his own version of shock. "Run!" I told him, since I had plenty of dead and living bodies on the scene already. "Move! Get the hell out of here, or you will be charged as a perpetrator of all this." "Screw you, bitch." "Okay, your call." I shrugged, sheathing one of my swords in order to reach in my jacket pocket for the small, cheap prepaid mobile phone also procured at the Roma Maiora Airport gift shop before departure, and thankfully charged during the flight. I used one hand to punch in the emergency code. At the same time, I used my other hand, still holding the second asp, to skewer De Luca through the abdomen, twisting painfully. And so that he cried and doubled over, dropping his sword and holding his gut. The emergency line operator picked up, and I modulated my voice immediately into helplessness, rising my pitch an octave higher into a disgusting female cliché and adding a quivering tone of fear. Yes, there's been a horrible incident of mass violence over at... I looked around for a street sign. Piazza di Signo. Please help. At least a dozen seriously wounded and more casualties. Horrible. Blood all over. Young men and boys dead and dying. Please, please hurry. Send ambulances immediately. Blood running into the canal, running in the street. So much blood. Please. I ended a hysterical weeping note while the operator tried to console what he thought was a panicking, anxious female. Yes, help was coming immediately. They were sending out multiple ambulances via airlift helicopter. All was going to be well. I hung up the phone, then coldly moved past the fallen dead and wounded, ignoring the moans and cries in the steps near the water. I got into the convertible where Adonetto was holding Barto's neck with a piece of fabric pressed against his wound. It didn't look good. Bartolo was passed out, and he was not breathing, and his pulse was almost non-existent, and, oh, there was so much damn blood all over the upholstery. You can help him now, yes? It's going to be okay, right? The ambulance, it's coming, so is he going to live? Adonetto started to mutter with a dark expression, all the while looking at me with intensity. All his fear and focus and attention were now in those blue eyes, and all of it trained on me. Not a trace of disdain, and instead of reliance on my authority. Just like that. It took death and murder to make that brat begin to respect me, I thought bitterly. Signorina Paola? Adonetto, I interrupted him in a hard voice. Then I cast my gaze around the small piazza with its fountain. Noticed Da Luca contorting in agony on the steps nearby. Noticed the others, moving, moaning, lying dead. See this, Adonetto? I pointed at the scene. He frowned, unsure of how to respond, then muttered, Yes. This is an act of God. Adonetto continued frowning in confusion. You mean, do we tell them it was an accident? It was... What is a god, Adonetto? I said, watching the tousled golden hair falling around the young, beautiful, stubborn face of the idiot before me. The young man shook his head, continuing to hold his fingers over Bartolo's throat with the blood-soaked rag. God is the Almighty, and He has judged us here today. Is that what we say? Not the Almighty on the ceiling of the Cappella Sistina, but a God. Listen carefully when I speak to you. Now, what is a god? The sound of helicopters came in the distance. I am not sure what you mean, Signorina Paola. What? I sigh in rising irritation. A god, by definition, is one who can experience everything at the same time in a probability set. Pain, pleasure, wonder, doubt, anger, love, terror. A god is multi-existential, I said. Are you a god, Adonetto? Do you feel all these things right now as you exist? Do you feel hate and love and fear and wonder all at once for these terribly human boys lying all over the place in various stages of mortality? No? Maybe you will someday. I nodded. Then let me tell you, I do. I am triumphant and broken and terrified and furious and sad and ecstatic and deadly right now. I am a god by my own definition. And as far as you are concerned, I am your god, Adonetto. From this moment on, you do as I say, and you listen to me and you obey, or I will destroy you. Adoneto's mouth parted. He was looking at me in absolute fascination, and then he moved his head slowly in the affirmative. Good, I said, letting out a breath. Then we are set for the moment. And then I added as the helicopters became visible overhead at last and were landing on the piazza around us. However, if Bartolo Ciarenza does not survive, I'm going to make your worthless life a living hell for as long as you are my responsibility. Is that clear, Adoneto? He blinked in fear and, dare I say, wonder. Yes. But seeing my narrowing eyes, he immediately added, Yes, Signorina Paola, Dea, goddess. But I was ignoring him already and waving to the EMTs as they filled the piazza, scattering a flock of pigeons that now circled in the distant sky overhead. Barto was all that mattered in this moment. It occurred to me, yes, I was definitely home. Home was not merely Italia, but wherever I had to be by my own definition, fully divine. I had my work cut out for me. The end. I hope you enjoyed. This has been a story called Streets Running Like a River, and you can actually pick it up on Kindle. It's available as a Kindle single story. And later on, it's going to be incorporated into a very intense, large series about Paola Moretti and what she does and how she spends her time. And basically, she's a hired swordswoman, kind of like a swords master, and she's not a young spring chicken, and she's got a lot of wisdom and experience to teach, and it's fun. So I hope you enjoyed the reading and enjoy the rest of the convention, because this is, again, it's a part of TagCon 2021 Quantum Blue. Thanks, everybody. This is Vera Nazarian. Bye.